Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on advancing ecosystem-based marine spatial planning through the Marine Map Decision Support System. We're very pleased to have Dr. Vanessa Stelzenmüller of the Thünen Institute of Sea Fisheries in Germany here with us today to present. My name is Sarah Carr. I'm Chief Knowledge Broker for OCTO, Open Communications for the Ocean. OCTO is an NGO that connects ocean professionals to the knowledge and networks they need through our webinar series and our MPA Help, EBM Help, and Ocean Plastic List communities. OCTO also provides custom consulting services. So just to let everyone know how today's webinar will run, we will start with a formal presentation by Vanessa, and then we will move on to Q&A. You can submit questions throughout the webinar, and we'll handle most of them except for brief clarifying questions after the main presentation is over. You can submit your questions preferably through the Q&A panel in the where there's a button for it at the bottom of the user interface, or if it's a question that you want to pose to the whole community, our chat is open, and you could post it in the chat and others will see it as well if you want them to respond as well. And as I mentioned, the chat is open to everyone for posting, and you can share things with the entire community. We just ask that you keep everything that you share with in the chat on the topic and professional. So a recording, I also wanted to let everyone know a recording of this webinar will be available later today at www.octogroup.org/webinars. So again, I'd like to thank Dr. Stelzenmüller, who's going to be speaking about advancing ecosystem-based marine spatial planning through the MarinePlan Decision Support System. We're very excited to have you on today, Vanessa, so we can learn more about MarinePlan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also quite excited to have the opportunity to talk today about our project MarinePlan and what we have achieved. So how our MarinePlan decision support system developed and has been applied. So as Sarah was already mentioning, my name is Vanessa Stelzenmüller, working at the Thünen Institute of Sea Fisheries in Germany. So to give us some background to the topic, I have a few slides explaining a little bit where we're coming from. So as we all know, we have still an increase, or seeing still an increase of human pressures and the risk of cumulative impacts on ecosystem components, functions, and processes. And next to climate change. And that's why we have that strong need and that strong call really to move forward with an ecosystem-based management approach. So an ecosystem-based management approach recognizes the human and natural system linkages. So that means we're looking at human societies, we look at ecosystem functions, but also we acknowledge that there's the need of economical sustainability. And all of this is, of course, funded on healthy marine and functioning marine systems. So by definition, that's what you see on that slide. An ecosystem-based approach is a strategy for an integrated management that recognizes or that tries to integrate marine protection and sustainable use. So as nicely described by a study by Horgan et al. In 2024, so an ecosystem-based management approach is not a one-off tool. This is basically a whole bunch of tools and governance processes working together to move towards the implementation of an ecosystem-based management approach. So on the bar chart that you see, you have the results of a questionnaire that that authors have been doing. And you can see among the top 3 tools mentioned, important for putting EBM forward is marine spatial planning. So, and this is something we see very broadly. And just to give you also an idea again, or a description of what is maritime or marine spatial planning is. So it's a process. A process means it's a cyclic process. in theory, it should be governance-led. It's a stepwise process that allocates human activities in space and time in order to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives. So it has, it starts with that strong or with a clear vision how the seas should be, should look like in 5, 10, 15 years, then coming up with planning options, producing then implementation, producing the outcomes, looking at the outcomes, evaluation of the plans, comes adaptation, and afterwards we have, again, a full cycle. So there are a few characteristics to marine spatial planning process, which I have listed here on the right-hand side. So it's integrated, it's meant to be cross-sectoral, it's place-based, it's adaptive because it's a process. It's really based on strong stakeholder engagement and co-development in theory. So it's a participatory process. It should be legally binding. So it requires a legal support, should be data-driven. We should use the best available knowledge, be transparent and uncertainties. And now we hope that planning moves towards ecosystem-based planning. So now looking at the development, let's say, of marine spatial planning or the implementation of spatial plans, on the left-hand side, you see that global picture, which I have extracted from a report from the IOC UNESCO 20. So the figures are from 24, where you can see on top are the countries that are engaged in marine spatial planning. So over the years between 17 and 23, you can see an increase, but also on the bottom of that bar, the bottom bar chart, you can see the number of approved marine spatial plans by that time. And you can see that in Europe, we have, the highest amount of implemented marine spatial plans. Now, from a European perspective, we have in Europe the European MSP Directive, which promotes sustainable development of marine uses to mitigate conflicts, but also to promote blue growth, basically. So member states had to implement legally binding maritime spatial plans by 21, but as I could see, or you could see in the middle of that map, there is still room for improvement. So these are the figures from 25, taken from the European MSP platform. You can see that there are still challenges. We have fragmented processes, competing priorities, and still looking at the actual planning processes, we have a weak integration of environmental objectives. And the new European Ocean Pact calls actually for revising the Marine Spatial Planning Directive to improve coherence with European policies, in particular in Europe with the MSFD, so the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So just to summarize a little bit the key challenges for marine spatial planning so far to really enhance marine conservation or to bring conservation considerations into planning. So as I just said, there are still legal institutional fragmentations. So very often planning for conservation measures is done somewhere else in government, while the MSP or the marine spatial planning is done somewhere else by other competent authorities. So there are still surprisingly data gaps and uncertainties to address, in particular socio-economic, but also ecological impacts. There's also the need to have better data that allows to conduct monitoring and evaluation of ongoing planning. There is still difficulties in transboundary settings because although in particular in Europe, we have European, let's say, policies that should drive marine spatial planning, it's implemented on a national basis. So that means planning is context dependent and it's done, the actual planning process is different in different countries. And very importantly is that we have a lack of practical guidance for ecosystem-based marine spatial planning. So, and this is actually where our project MarinePlan was coming from or wanted to deliver on that gap. So a MarinePlan was a European Horizon project which ended in September 25, run for 3 years. We had 16 international partners all over in southern Europe, northern Europe. We had 8 planning sites, as you can see on that map. So you can see that we had national EEZs, the Celtic Sea, Bay of Biscay, the Azores, but also we had smaller scale areas, regional areas like the Campania region, for example. So all planning sites have established stakeholder groups, and all planning sites developed different planning options and helped to develop the MarinePlan decision support tool and to test it. And so a common denominator in the project was to really that in all of those areas, independent where marine spatial planning processes have been at that moment, to develop planning scenarios that help to meet the 2030-2010 targets. That is the European Biodiversity Strategy Directive, the strategy, which is that 30% of marine areas under protection, of which 10% of strict protection. So this was the overall goal for planning, and also then to improve the scientific knowledge and to show how practically conservation planning can be integrated into marine spatial planning. So for the last, let's say, 20 minutes or so, I will talk you basically through the MarinePlan decision support systems and all the different elements, and give you some background, some examples, so that you can understand what we have been developing. So we have been in, let's say, an interdisciplinary setting, a group of people. So we had natural sciences, we had social science methodologies, and overall we developed a standardized framework with a decision support system that helps to develop these scenarios. So we use, of course, and we're starting from marine spatial planning processes or initiatives. We have been considering EBSAs, ecological or biological significant areas. I will explain that in a minute. Connectivity considerations, and this has been a common denominator to bring in that EBSA and connectivity considerations in all planning options as a planning foundation, and we had strong development with the planning site stakeholders. So along this decision support system, so actually the first thing that we did was to say, okay, an ecosystem-based marine spatial planning framework, how does that look like? What does it mean? So I just described that marine spatial planning is a process. It has different process steps and elements. So we have been looking at the ecosystem approach principles to management, and we basically have been knitting in these ecosystem, the EBA principles, basically into a planning process. So along all the different steps of planning, how can we consider these ecosystem-based principles to planning? So overall, we have been defining 130 tasks and action points that would be part of such a framework, and we also delivered with it a standardized benchmarking system. So that meaning you can go through all these actions and looking at if a statement or an action is relevant in a particular context, what has been the knowledge base used to implement that certain task, what is the confidence of the person that assess this, to what extent has it been actually implemented. So this is the beauty of it, is that this has been implemented as an online tool. It's a web app application. Everyone can just log in and do an assessment. And with the assessment, you basically could assess a process as such, or if you are in a planning process, you can see, okay, you can use it as a checkbox. What do we need actually to fulfill that idea of an ecosystem-based marine spatial planning process? Or you can start using it to engage with your stakeholders. Just want to mention there was a previous OCTO seminar just on that tool, and so this is important to mention here. So, and this is just to give you a glimpse how that looks like. So you go through all the different 130 steps, you do this assessment, you get graphics, interactive, which you can move around and check, but also you can just stop at any time, save your results, download the results, and share it with colleagues. And so we have, from a global perspective, we have a very nice buy-in in the use of that tool. So it's really nice to see. And just to mention it again, so also this tool has been developed together with the high-level stakeholders' needs. So we have been conducting stakeholder workshops, so with marine planners from different countries, but also with European representatives, and to really define, what are the components and the needs of that tool. So now, after establishing that framework of EBMSP, as I said, a very important was understanding this governance setting and working with the stakeholders. So we had basically done so part of the decision system are two aspects. The first is to get an idea who does what in a governance system. So we have been producing guidance to conduct a policy audit, and for all the planning sites and for all the countries, we have been actually producing these policy audits to understand how governance is actually operationalized. And then in a second step, we assessed how is the actual adaptive capacity of ongoing, let's say, approaches and procedures to make that happen, to more align conservation aspects, in that case, into marine spatial planning in order to achieve the 2030, 3010 goal. And we also have been working on stakeholder engagement and communication tools such as Ocean Viz. But just to explain it a little bit more, we have been basically the policy audits and all the narrative around it has been implemented with the help of ArcGIS story maps. So this QR code leads you to the story maps and also the link. And so for all these different planning sites, we had these 8 different story maps, also translated in the respective languages. And attached to it was also a survey to get an idea on the barriers and enablers for adaptive marine governance. So, and this again helped us to then produce for each of the planning sites policy briefs, which then described of what are the challenges, what are the barriers, or what is needed to align better conservation into marine conservation and restoration considerations into marine spatial planning. So I think it's really such a useful and rich information that you can see, and you find those policy briefs under that link. Now, moving along our decision support system, as I mentioned before, another component what we needed or what we want, that we developed for planning was really the EBSA, so ecological, biological significant areas and connectivity. This is a concept established by the CBD, and the EBSA criteria. So there are 7 EBSA criteria, and there are different ways how you can actually map these criteria in order to bring it into a planning scenario or into a planning option. So in the project, we looked at different ways of operationalizing that, and so this has been used in all the planning sites. So here, for example, you can see a nice study from the Bay of Biscay, where the EBSAs, all the 7 criteria have been mapped basically and integrated, but all planning sites at least looked at biological productivity, biological diversity, and most of the times also in naturalness. So these has been the layers that have been put forward then for planning the scenarios. Another important feature, and a very challenging one, was to consider connectivity aspects for all planning sites, basically. So in MarinePlan, we developed a baseline method to quantify the physical connectivity for all planning sites. So basically, we used the passive drift approach. So we modeled using connectivity as Lagrangian particle tracking. And so basically it's about the potential connectivity from currents and pelagic larval duration. So we did that assessment for each of those planning sites, and the kind of outputs that we have been producing have been connectivity matrices, which can be used. So spanning, as you see in the white tiles here on that map, as you can see, that's having quite fine resolution spanning over larger times. So all these model runs are accessible and available, have been available for the planning sites, and then there have been there could be indices that have been used for planning for the planning scenarios to characterize structural connectivity. Now, and another challenge is, now that we have all the foundations and all the different layers, another challenge was, how would you, or how do you actually provide a standardized way of approaching a planning scenario or planning options? Because everyone would slightly do it differently, although we have a common goal, 30% of the marine area, and of which 10% of strict protection, but the whole narrative around it is it could be very different. So we developed a decision support tree basically that guides through that decision-making process. What are the layers I'm using? So we what is the minimum? It was, as I said, the EPSAs, the connectivity aspects, but then there are other climate relevant features, but also the different human uses, because of the marine spatial planning context of the different planning sites. And to implement actually these decision tree, or to do the actual spatial planning or deriving planning options, we developed also a range of tools, but I will explain that also in a few slides. So but also, so we have the standardized procedure, but also we develop an approach to frame the different planning narratives. So it's very important to get that future perspective, or the different futures that could be assessed. And so what we have been doing is to assess with also a global survey, what are the drivers that could influence planning options. That's actually also a paper had been led by Stelios Kastanavakis, and we have been then translating these different factors into scenarios, and then also into planning options. So basically, we had, along the axis of climate change, stable political situations, or environmental considerations, for the project, we defined 4 different scenarios under which the 30 and 10% targets have been would be achieved in different ways. So this helped really to set then these 4 scenarios. And then with our standardized decision support tree, then depending on which scenario you have been assessing, you then collect basically what kind of layers you need to conduct your scenarios. And as I said, this has been supported by a range of newly developed planning tools. So all of the tools and everything that I'm explaining right now, most of it has been described by papers and deliverables, which can be all found on our project website. So still papers are coming up, although the project ended. We are still now in our productive phase, and but all the tools, that's important, all the tools are, or most of them are now published and available. And so here, for example, we have a 3D planning approach, PriorCon, a way of digesting the connectivity matrices, ecological corridors, prior OECMs, how to assess potential OECM areas, and so on. So there are a number of tools that help then. These are spatial optimization tools, which complement Maxan or Prioritas R, that maybe many of you know. So that these specialized tools that really help to bring these aspects of connectivity also into the planning. Now, to show it a little bit how it looked like, I have 3 examples to share. So basically, we have for the Campania planning site, which is on the map, as you can see, in the Italian coast, the smallest planning site we had. We have a small coverage of MPAs. Only a small fraction of that is under strict protection. It's quite an area which is a biodiversity hotspot also, but there are many human uses also going on, and there is a strong interest also into marine spatial planning. So the objective of the planning site was to assess the effectiveness of the existing MPAs, Natura 2000 sites, fisheries restricted areas, and considering the EPSA features. And then we had also and then another second objective was to see if there are additional protection or restoration priorities, and including connectivity. So just a glimpse how then this looked like. For example, the realistic scenarios that this, to achieve the 30 and the 10%. So in that case, for example, to achieve the 10%, all existing MPAs should be under strict protection. The Natura 2000 site should be more enforced, and to reach the 30% for that scale in that area, the role of OECMs had to be really recognized. So with these results, we show that, for example, here OECMs might be something to look at, and this has been a realistic view on conducting this planning or conducting the planning scenarios in that region. The next example is the Southern North Sea planning site. It's a transboundary setting. So as you can see from that map, we have Belgium, we have the Netherlands, we have Germany, we have English waters, and that are the outline of the Southern North Sea area. So you can see all these green areas are basically protection sites, and based on the Natura, most of them are the Natura 2000 sites. So it's for that area. It's about 44%. It's under a kind of protection scheme, but there's no real strict protection, and it's one of the most used areas in the world. And next to the green areas, you see the blue areas, which is development schemes or the future development of offshore wind in that area. So the planning objective for the Southern North Sea was to see, okay, where should we put the 10% strict protection in such a highly used area? While we want to achieve the conservation targets, we also have the energy production targets. And we really explode here the role of transboundary planning. So just to give you an example of some of the results. So for example, on the left-hand side, if you would achieve or address that need of 30 and 10% from a national perspective, this is the result you see on the left-hand side. You get a more fragmented solution or planning options for the strict protection areas. On the right-hand side, if you would approach that from a more ecosystem perspective, so a transboundary planning approach, you would have larger and less fragmented MPA areas or protection areas, which might bring better net conservation benefits. And the third and last example I'm going to show is the Western Mediterranean Sea planning site. It's also a huge planning site area. It had European and non-European countries. It's a heavily used areas, and there is, of course, also no transboundary planning, marine spatial planning in place, and actually no regional planning in place. And there's only a small fraction of the Western Mediterranean which is under some kind of management plan. It's a biodiversity hotspot, and it's also battered by marine heat waves and warming, which is still increasing. So here the objective of that planning site was really to look at also transboundary scenarios for MSP to meet the trend and conservation planning, to meet the 2030-30-10 targets, and to have an improved science base for describing EPSAs. So here are some results. So you basically you have the same picture emerging as from the Southern North Sea. If you really consider connectivity, 3D planning, climate change, is receiving at the end less fragmented areas. So there's a lot of detail to that, and these are some example results. Now, slowly coming to an end, and looking at all these scenarios that we have been producing, so we can see that there was really that future-oriented approach, and we identified priority areas to meet the 2030-3010 targets, which are really beyond most marine spatial planning scopes. And also we considered the climate change projections and also the different policy and political developments. So for all the planning sites, we considered EPSAs and structural connectivity. And although we have used EPSAs and structural connectivity as a shared principles, the methods and the way the different planning sites have dealt with the actual indicators or the indices varied in context to the available, let's say, data and boundary conditions. But for all the planning sites, we have been using those. So for all scenarios, we had a multi-sectoral approach, looked at trade-offs, considered climate change aspects. And also we had produced for all the cases new data, new data layers, and offering also stronger basis for future spatial planning. We promoted really stakeholder engagement, not only on the planning side level, because all the tools have been tested, and also then the scenarios have been to most extent been discussed with the stakeholders. So that led me to the conclusions that the whole idea of having such a standardized approach, so the MarinePlan decision support systems, really supports ecosystem-based maritime spatial planning by providing tools and practical guidance along a very structured and a clear process. So the current marine spatial planning approaches lack very often, that's what we learn from the planning sites, lack very often the forward look approaches. So that means there is a current limitation of marine spatial planning processes to really work strongly with scenarios and really look at all these different options. So EBM-SP, as we have been now presenting it here, really accounts for scenarios that really align with conservation, climate, and socioeconomic transitions. And applying this framework, not only, so the whole decision support system not only shows you where the gaps are in terms of maybe a process or maybe some data that are needed, doing this, it also gives you some ideas how to move from scenarios to actions. So because with the actual data that you are providing, or the actual overlap between conservation planning, setting objectives for planning, and the objective setting, for example, in a marine spatial planning context, you see already where forces or where resources could be bundled in order to have stronger conservation considerations in planning. And still there are constraints of data and knowledge gaps, which sometimes limited a bit the scenario development. But overall, moving in the direction of and implementing EBMSP really requires also that co-development, in particular in the scenarios, to get that buy-in of these different futures. And it requires also, in particular, for transboundary settings, better sharing of data, and to identify, as I just have said, practical steps towards bundling resources. So there is maybe just some little steps that can help really to make a big difference. And with that, I'm at the end, and I just want to say I'm presenting MarinePlan, which has been a collaborative project with a fantastic group of scientists that has been really a joy to coordinate and to work with. And for all the results, all the things I have just showed and presented, you can find that on the website. And for all the planning sites, when you have particular questions, you can see, for example, in the policy briefs all the names and of the PIs and the scientists that have been put so much effort also in the planning side work, where you can just get in touch with people if you have want more information, more material. So with that, I would like to thank you and stop my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. We have a lot of great questions already. So it was a great presentation. There was great engagement, lots of interest in getting the slides too, which I'll talk to you about afterwards. Um, and then we have a number of questions. So let's get started with those. A question, how does transboundary management work for these areas? How is the trans-regional, transnational coordination and particularly enforcement? How does that work?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for all the region, but in general, there is no, let's say, formal transboundary process. There is rather, let's say, an information of your neighbors and your neighboring, let's say, processes, and people talk to each other. And let's say in the European context, of course, we have in DG Mare, there is the European Marine Planners working group where actually international or the European planners meet and can have an exchange. But to establish a transboundary planning approach does not exist. Although I have to say, for the North Sea region, at least, there is the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative at the moment that recognize that there's so much offshore wind, there's so much effect on fisheries, there's so much effect on the risk of cumulative effects that it needs to be approached from a more transboundary case. So it's a ministerial-led process. So slowly we are getting into this more, let's say, collaborative groups and initiatives.
Thank you, Vanessa. Another question that came in, for the selection of the 10% areas in the southern North Sea, which criteria in particular were considered, and which of those drove the choice of location?
Yeah, so the oyster grounds, establishing oyster grounds for European oysters have been one of the key features to look for the 10%.
Okay. And I'm not sure. So a couple others sort of on a related note. Building on the last question, what definition of strict protection are you using? We have a few, in quotes, highly protected marine areas in England, but it's a relatively new concept.
Yes, we also recognize that, for example, in the ISIS working group of marine protected areas, there has been quite some work in looking at these differences of strict protection, strictly protected, zero use. But we here for MarinePlan, we use zero use. So no uses.
Thank you. Another question. I cannot believe that NGOs would agree with no strict protection in Netherlands waters and do not understand the ratio, particularly in relationship to rebuilding oyster reefs in Netherlands German waters, which was also a MarinePlan topic. Please explain a little more.
Actually, I don't know if I get the question right. Maybe you can repeat that because I couldn't really follow the question.
It is, let's see if there's any follow-up later on. I cannot believe that NGOs would agree with no strict protection in Netherlands waters and do not understand the ratio, particularly in relation to rebuilding oyster reefs in Netherlands and German waters, which was also a MarinePlan topic. Please explain a bit more.
Yeah, so sorry, I really don't get the question properly. So that person might get in touch later on, or maybe I can do it by email. Sorry.
No problem. Moving on, let's see. Concerning connectivity between basins and MPAs, how do you consider the country's marine spatial plan? For example, in Portugal, the marine spatial plan also includes protection areas, namely because several protected areas have marine areas. Let's see, I'm not
So
sure yeah,
so the question is
say I'm
if if connectivity is considered in actual marine spatial planning.
Let's go with that for now, and I'm sort of rereading it to see if I have the full meaning too.
Mm.
Let's move on, and I'll study that question a little more to see if. Let's see. In your North Sea example, the regional approach to establishing strict protection, which was promoted because it would be more conservation efficient, also put more of the conservation burden on one country. What were
Yeah.
government reactions to this proposal? Were you able to document potential trade-offs?
Mhm. Yeah, actually, this is we are right now in putting the final results together. This is how it usually happens. If you just have a huge project and after 3 years, you're now in the process of getting things together. But this is actually quite a good point. So this comes, of course, with trade-offs, and so I think that we have not presented these, or that the group hasn't presented these to the actual, let's say, planners as such, but at least it raises the options of how meaningful and how effective conservation planning would be. And in particular, in the, let's say, European context, of course, we have now the European Restoration Regulation, which also calls for more measures in terms of protection, also for habitats, which is another, it puts another, let's say, percentage and another targets up there. So this is actually something that has to be debated, and yes, it should be debated how to approach that. But I think we won't overcome that situation that we have in European policies, and it's implemented on a national basis. I think if we would do that, saying this would be for real, this would be a really such a great step forward. But at least it raises exactly this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Let's see, another question. Well, starts off, thank you for a thorough, clear, and super interesting presentation, Vanessa. I wonder if you discussed whether EBSAs actually say anything about ecosystem functioning. They may be critically important in flagging ecologically important areas, based, of course, on known biodiversity, which is not comprehensive. But what they project is high biodiversity structure, not what areas are important to maintaining functioning. This is especially true because marine EBSAs do not link to terrestrial. Can you explain how you tackled this? Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, absolutely. I'm not, and I hope I didn't bring that across, that we should only consider EPSA as the only means of considering ecosystem functions and processes. But there is primary productivity that we have been using. But it's true that it is not covering like nursery areas or feeding areas and all the different, or carbon sequestration, carbon storage potential, and all of that, which is not part of the EPSA, let's say, criteria. But because EPSA have been for a long time established by the CBD, but only implemented in a small fraction of in our planning sites, EPSAs, and it also has been, let's say, it has been also the call from the Commission to look at the potential of EPSAs to use that as a common denominator. That's why we really focused here on EPSAs. But yes, it's not covering all, and I think to start somewhere, EPSAs are a good start.
Thank you, Vanessa. A question, what adaptations to the process would be required to enable and ensure the participation of stakeholders in regions with low literacy, limited connectivity, and unequal power systems?
Sorry, again, once more, please.
Oh, what adaptations to the process that you described would be required to enable and ensure the participation of stakeholders in regions with low literacy, limited connectivity, and unequal power systems?
Yeah, I think we would look at, I can tell it from the top of my mind what the policy briefs, like the enablers or what the potentials are. So I would have to look at the policy briefs in detail and maybe look at those examples. But I have to say that for all the planning sites, and we had a clear idea, and we could conduct a policy audit. We had clear responsibilities. So maybe this is not the extreme case that the question is referring to, but I would just invite that person maybe, or not everyone, of course, I would invite to look at the policy briefs and on the 8 and in particular on the cases, also in the context of the different planning sites that describes the adaptive capacity and what is needed actually to increase the adaptive capacity of the existing governance scheme.
Okay, thank you. And then was there anything that would be changed for participation of stakeholders in sort of low capacity areas?
Changed? No. Well, I think what we have been doing, so just to be clear, that we had not, that, I mean, it is a scientific project which really try to foster co-development, so we don't have a legal, or we are not planners, right? So so what we have been achieving, I think, is to increase, let's say, the exchange and facilitated really the dialogue between the stakeholders that see how, and that followed the process and the idea of bringing conservation, connectivity, climate aspects into this planning process. So we had the national planners looking at the project and working with us on certain aspects, on the tools or on the scenarios. And I think this is what we have achieved. If we increase the capacity, I don't know, because at the end, it's really we know that in general that the capacity, that the power that governments have to just implement maritime spatial plans and marine spatial plans are very often very limited.
Okay, and actually that sort of leads us to a question that came in the chat. Does it make sense to start an MSP process if there's no commitment to implement it by the affected governments?
I would say yes. I mean, it's a strategic. So there is a difference between a strategic MSP process and a legally binding process. So if there is no, and this is when it has no legal basis, it doesn't have any teeth, right? So that means a strategic process does make sense to start developing in these visions, the objectives, and based on those objectives, how would you allocate space to different activities, including marine conservation, restoration, bringing climate change consideration into planning as mitigation measures, or areas that are important, or areas that are important for an energy transition, for example, to green energy. So I think it makes sense to move forward in order to see the whole picture. And I think this is the biggest message, no? To marine spatial planning really helps to, it's not the idea of just to plan everything, but to give also some security of an idea what we can do to maintain a certain state or to improve a state and to move towards certain objectives.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay. Another question that came in, what is the approximate amount of time required to work through the assessment framework? And what is the time commitment required from stakeholders?
Good question. So Yvonne Galpasoro from ATSTI, they had said that it took the Spanish and the French stakeholders together. They have been sitting 4 or 5 hours together with them, explaining, showing this different assessments. So I think if this question refers to the assessment tool, then I would say if you have a good idea on the actual what's going on, it might take you a day. If you have to reach out, and if you start from scratch and you never heard anything about marine spatial planning, okay, then you need to reach out and to see where do I find the documentation for how a plan has been established, or what would be actually the information I would need or the data I would need to conduct this task. So, but if you would use that framework to assess an ongoing or an already implemented plan, I would say a day to get a first round. But as I said, in that web-based tool, you always have the option to stop, talk to people, come back to it. Engaging with stakeholders, really, it depends on what kind of relation there is. If it's a new relation to people, it always costs a bit more effort. If you have already an established working relationship, it could be a punctual information. For example, in Germany, we had let's say a few hours workshop with the marine spatial planning team from the German government to explain the tool and to assess with them the different responses. So I think, but key is that these things are, at least that assessment tool explains itself quite good, so you don't need to have so much technical knowledge to use that. And I think this is why we had that co-development with stakeholders, because we asked the planners before, what is it, what would help you?
Fantastic. Thank you, Vanessa. And some questions along this line. We'll start with one of them. Which systematic conservation planning tools are the most used for the prioritization of the areas to protect?
You mean in general? So I think marks and prioritize are the standard tools. So with the 3D planning tool, we considered the different depth zones, which makes also in some regions quite a difference. And so the rest is, as I said, brand new. So the connectivity ones and the prior OECM and so on. So I would say for minimum, everyone has used Prioritize R, but then also most of them the 3D planning approach. And I think this has been common for everyone.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Sort of related to that, if there's anything to add, I'll read another question if there's anything to add for this. Could you please briefly explain the data and methodology used to identify the 30% areas of protection and the 10% of strict protection? And does it vary for each ecosystem-based marine spatial plan?
Yes. So I cannot talk for all of the planning sites at the same time, but the decision tree that I was showing was when you have marine protected areas, on what basis they have been defined, what has been the objective? Are you moving or are you working with other, let's say, environmental policies that oblige you to protect certain features, let's say. This is a starting point. But for us, we said the 30-10%, but having this biodiversity consideration, so the EPSA, the biodiversity consideration was here in the middle of our planning scenarios. So actually this narrative of where do you start, it looks so trivial. Oh, you just just select your different layers, but no, there was really an intensive discussions and thinking, how would you set your different targets? And so this decision has been made for all the planning sites in it differently. So, but we all followed the same steps, but the decisions, what features have been selected are different.
Thank you, Vanessa. And just we are not going to run out of questions, so we'll keep going till the end, and then just let everyone know I'll provide all the questions to Vanessa so she can take a look. She is currently in a meeting, so I would not expect any sort of quick response. Let's see. Another question that came in. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering if there is close communication collaboration with small-scale fishers in protected area management strategies. You mentioned that highly protected means zero use. In what context is artisanal fishing included in the different forms of management?
Yeah, I can say I think in the Greek case study or planning side that we have, there is small scale fisheries involved. There was also an index for mapping out fishing activities. So I think that there has been communication also with small-scale fisheries. But to what extent, I have to say, I can't really answer for all of them. This, again, is a question that maybe you could really address to the PIs or to the team of scientists working in the different planning sites.
Thank you, Vanessa. A question, how does MSP get incorporated into a tiered environmental impact assessment framework? For example, how can a regional or strategic environmental assessment or a project level assessment be informed by and inform marine spatial planning?
Oh God, this is a super complex question. So, in theory, each maritime spatial plan or each spatial plan has to do a strategic environmental assessment. So, SEA is mandatory for a marine plan. So that means looking at what are the effects of a plan. So the socioeconomic effects or impacts, but also the environmental impacts. So, and this is something on a higher level, and then you have underneath, you have on an individual or project level base, you have then the impacts, so an environmental impact assessments when you do, for example, when you plan for different things, for example, like building offshore wind projects and so on. So this is regulated differently. So this is a sectoral development plan, basically, and ideally this would inform marine spatial planning. So I can just advise that also because I'm just sitting now at in ISIS and Copenhagen at the moment, that there has been a lot of work on the cumulative effects assessment for management, and also that idea of having that marine spatial planning, having the impacts of on a wider scale, and how do the single project assessment feed into that. There has been a lot of thought around that, but the strategic environmental SEA assessments are really key to understand the impact of marine spatial plans.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Question that came up, what about the rest of the future unprotected 70%? How should the environment be considered in those areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for that, thank God, we are thinking in circles or in adaptive processes, because we have seen that external factors can change things quite dramatically. So, for example, having a sensitive infrastructure at sea could undermine any good planning, because suddenly you're restricting, for example, co-use solutions, or you're restricting the development of certain things because you want to have a more secure setting. So I think this is something which cannot be set out in the long term. But if we allow ourselves to say we think in these cycles of, actually, the marine spatial planning cycle is different. So in some countries it's 6 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years. I think this is a fine mid-term solution to see how this all will develop. And maybe in 5 years' time we have to set different objectives or priorities because we have a different situation. And so this is the answer. Everything is in transition and in changes. And for this, we need flexible planning processes that allow us to adapt.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. Question, what do you do if an area does not have enough data or information, especially the EBSAs?
Yeah, so what would you do? So if you want to use EBSAs, at the least thing you can do, you can try to look at local knowledge, or you have guesswork experts. I think something is most of the times known, either though you have lots of uncertainty around it. At least you can communicate that how let's say certain layers have been produced. I mean, at the end of the day, for using these spatial planning or spatial optimization tools, you need spatial data, and however you arrive to your certain polygon or to a certain area, this is also something this is up to the data availability. If there was no data available, but you have a good guess that it's a certain sandbank or there's a certain area with a biodiversity hotspot, you might want to indicate that and putting it forward into a planning option.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. And then one final question. Are you able to do anything to promote effective monitoring of the areas?
So monitoring was actually something that we didn't touch upon really in the project, but this would be exactly the next step to show if this would be the objective, and based on these ecological, let's say, or the conservation consideration and restoration considerations, you would then design the monitoring scheme that really looks at the impact of the plans and if the plan really achieves its objectives in that sense. So I can't really report on any good ideas in terms of having a really coherent and standardized monitoring approach, but this would be the next step. And this is part of planning, setting objectives, which, and this means also smart objectives, smart indicators, which also tell you us what we need in terms to monitor the outcomes and to assess planning outcomes.
Okay. Vanessa, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. Like lots of requests to get the slides if possible. I'll contact you about that outside because it's just really just been incredibly informative, the presentation, and your staying to answer all these questions, the fabulous questions from our audience, who's very engaged and very interested in learning from the work of the MarinePlan project. So thank you again for coming on to speak with us. We so appreciate it. And we hope to have you again in a few years to report on the further follow-up to MarinePlan. And thank you to everyone who attended and asked such great questions. As I noted, we'll post the webinar recording on OCTO's website. You'll have to scroll down underneath our upcoming webinars to our past webinars, and there'll be you can click on this webinar to get to the page for this webinar. And please share the recording with anyone who will be interested. Thank you again, Vanessa, and we hope to hear from you again soon about other upcoming work.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.